This is The Road Show, and I'm your host, David Warren. On today's program, I will interview an author named Andrea Jo Rodgers, who has written a new book entitled On Heaven's Doorstep, subtitled God's Help in Times of Crisis, True Stories from a First Responder. And that's exactly what she does, is she is one of those first responders on the scene after a crisis, and she is our guest for the hour. Andrea, it's good to have you with us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be a guest. I'm thrilled to be here.
Well, I think it is very interesting what you do for a living for which you get paid, and then what you do for which you do not get paid. And we'll talk mainly about that, about volunteering as an EMT, which is an emergency medical technician. But tell us what you do at your day job.
I'm a physical therapist at an outpatient center that's affiliated with a hospital, and I treat patients with orthopedic problems, neurological problems like strokes, and my specialty areas are treating people with lymphedema, which is swelling often related to cancer in our setting, and I'm also certified to treat women's problems like urinary incontinence, for example.
What attracted you to the medical field?
Well, it's funny that you ask, because back when I was in high school, I originally picked the College of William & Mary because they had a very good business program. And through my volunteer work with the First Aid Squad, I realized that I really liked the health-related professions. Mm-hmm. So I ended up switching and going into physical therapy. And it's been such a blessing.
So for 20 years, you have been a physical therapist at a trauma center. But for even more years, for 30 years, you have volunteered as an EMT, which I mentioned earlier, is an emergency medical technician. Now, these are the people that we see riding in an ambulance.
Yes, we're pretty fortunate in this area. At least I feel fortunate because I can volunteer. I think in lots of areas of the country, it's a paid profession. So here in parts of New Jersey, we're still volunteer. But more and more so, certain areas are becoming at least partly paid and partly volunteer.
So do the math for us and tell us about how many response calls that is per week.
Well, the number varies quite a bit because we're a shore town. So we tend to be very busy in the summer. We get a lot of visitors to town. We have a lot of beach calls. And in the winter, we're a little quieter. So I would estimate maybe 3 or 4 calls during the winter months, but upwards of 10 during the summer months.
Wow. So it has to happen after hours for you, after your work hours, I mean.
Yes. So I'm fortunate. I work part-time. So I work 7:30 in the morning till 1 o'clock, and that gives me time to come home and have time with my children and also to answer first aid calls, more so like in the evenings and weekends.
Do you answer a call at 3 in the morning?
I sure do. I'm officially on Thursday night crew. That's the night that I have to answer. I'm the lieutenant right now, so I'm in charge of Thursdays. And on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, it's whoever can answer answers. So since that's when I tend to be home, I do tend to answer quite a bit at night.
Well, thank you for what you do for the people of New Jersey and for our country.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure, truly. It's been a blessing to me.
Well, I don't know a whole lot about emergency medical technicians, so I am very intrigued by this book we'll be reading from today, On Heaven's Doorstep. And I did also go on the web and watch some YouTube videos about EMTs, and I learned that there are 3 levels of people who work or ride in the ambulance. And the first is what you are, an EMT, emergency medical technician. And tell us what you are able to do, because there are different levels, and based on your level, you can give more care.
Right. So in New Jersey, the EMTs, we go to school. It's about a 200-hour certification now, and we can do the assessment. We provide oxygen. We can give Narcan, EpiPens, and, of course, do basic things like CPR and basic first aid bandaging, applying oxygen, things like that. The paramedics in our area are paid, and they come from the hospital. They give advanced life support. So they would be the ones giving an IV line, giving cardiac medications or other types of medications, and establishing an airway, like intubating a patient if they weren't breathing. So things like that.
What this video said on YouTube was that an entry EMT, or just a regular one, can give basic life support but cannot break the skin of the person in need. Is that a pretty good description?
That is a pretty good description, although I think theoretically, like if we gave an EpiPen, then we would break the skin.
Okay.
Because that's a puncture into the thigh. That's a pretty long needle.
And that's if you have like an allergic reaction, I believe.
Right. So that's anaphylactic shock. If someone had a life-threatening allergic reaction, then we provide an EpiPen.
The other group between the EMT and the paramedic was an advanced EMT, and I'm not real sure what that is. Do you know what that is?
I think they might have that in Virginia, but they don't have it in New Jersey.
Well, I bet you are advanced.
So I think they have like certain skills that we can't do, but that that medics can. It's like that gray area.
So tell us what happens in an ambulance between the point of crisis and arriving at the hospital. What's taking place?
I'll bring you back a step even further. So we're pretty fortunate because we live in a small town, so we can stay at our house until our pager goes off. So we'll get our pager will go off, and the dispatcher will tell us the location and the nature, and it'll also go off on our cell phones. And then we go to the ambulance, to the first aid building. We get the ambulance, then we drive to the scene of the call. And then depending on what is going on, we provide whatever first aid they need. So whether it be a car accident or a heart attack or a stroke, or we often get fall victims. Once we get them stabilized and into the ambulance, then it's about a 10-minute trip to the hospital. And if we think it's something that requires paramedics, they get dispatched the same time we do, depending on, like, certain words trigger them, anything like chest pain or unconscious. And they'll come to assist us. If we don't need them, then we cancel them.
So is your purse and are your shoes ready to go at any moment?
Yes, they always are.
Okay.
They really are.
Tell us what kind of equipment is found in the ambulance.
We have a wide variety of equipment. We have several jump kits, so that's what we bring into the house with us. And one has more trauma type of things in it, lots of dressings and bandages and roller gauze and cling and things like that. The other one is geared more towards respiratory problems, oxygen tanks, ambu bags or bag valve masks to help people breathe, different types of nasal cannulas to provide oxygen, airway tools, like we put airways into people's mouths or up into their nose, nasopharyngeal airways, blood pressure cuffs, things like that. So that's what we bring into the house. But in the ambulance, we also have things like suction. If a person needs to have their airway cleared, we have the EpiPens and all sorts of different types of equipment like burn kits and things like that. Anything you could think of that you would need in an emergency, warming blankets and, of course, things to protect ourselves, gloves and masks and gowns, things like that.
Well, I know that you're helping the patient at that point. The person has become a patient. I know that you're helping them with their physical needs, but how are you helping them with their mental needs? Because the mind, I'm sure, is in overdrive.
Right. Well, in the back of the ambulance, I'm definitely a hand holder. So I'll pat their shoulder, hold their hand, if they seem like they want that or need that. Sometimes patients ask us to pray for them, and then we certainly do. Most of the members of my first aid squad are active in church, so it's pretty easy for us to answer that request.
So if you are asked, can you share your faith there in the ambulance?
We do. Yep.
I'm talking with Andrea Jo Rodgers today on The Road Show, and when we come back, we will dive into her book On Heaven's Doorstep. And in the book, she says, in life or death, there's only one guarantee, that God will be there. We'll read some of these inspirational stories when we come back today on The Road Show.
I'm David Warren, here with some exciting news for Oasis listeners. We have a new mobile device app. It's free, easy to download, and lets you enjoy our refreshing music and talk everywhere you go. If you have an Android cell phone, go to the Google Play Store. And if you have an iPhone or iPad, visit the Apple Store and search for Oasis Radio Network. Be an Oasis ambassador and share this news with family and friends around the world.
There's food for the hungry, joy for the sad. I found an oasis of love. Oasis Network.
On today's Roadshow, I'm David Warren talking with Andrea Jo Rodgers, and we're talking about giving God's help in times of crisis, and we will be sharing some true stories from a first responder. And Andrea is that first responder that we're talking about and with today. And if you missed the first segment, she has been volunteering as an EMT or an emergency medical technician for 30 years. What keeps you going, Andrea? Because that's a long time to be a volunteer.
Well, it's funny because I joined the first aid squad when I was high school, and I really didn't intend to join. I was working as an office clerk in the beach office selling beach badges, and one of the beach cops came in and he asked me to join the squad, and I said, no, I was too busy. I didn't know anything about first aid. I was going into my senior year. I was in a lot of clubs. I ran track. And for every excuse I gave not to join, he countered with the reason that I should. So I eventually caved in and I joined the first aid squad because I couldn't think of a good enough reason not to satisfy him. And then once I started, I really enjoyed it. I like helping people, and we are a small town, so oftentimes I end up knowing the victim, and they're happy to see me, and I'm glad to help. And the other thing is, too, there's just such a tremendous need. We always need more volunteers, so I feel a sense of responsibility to keep going.
So I will let you speak to our listeners here in just a bit and encourage them to volunteer as an EMT.
Sounds good.
Of course, we'll need a little training, but we'll cover that here in just a bit. Well, you are an established author now because the book that we're talking about today is the second that you have written for Harvest House. The first was entitled At Heaven's Edge, True Stories of Faith and Rescue.
Yes.
What do you think the standout story from that book was, or the one that you hear most about from your readers?
The standout story in that one was definitely called Buried Alive.
Ooh, tell us about it.
Yes. Well, I was actually working as a beach cop, and it was a beautiful summer day, a hot summer day, and I was riding along. We rode on bicycles at that time, and my first aid pager went off, and the dispatcher said, first aid call at the beach for a person buried alive. I thought, buried alive? That has to be a mistake. How would you be buried alive at the beach? So I was only a couple blocks away. I rushed over on my bicycle, ran down onto the beach. There was already a crowd forming, and my boss, one of the police officers, was there, and he said, Andrea, start digging. There's possibly a girl somewhere here under the sand. And what happened was there was a bunch of volleyball players who were playing volleyball, and they had noticed that a young girl had been digging a giant hole in the sand all morning. Mm-hmm. And at one point, they turned around, and the hole was gone. And so they weren't sure what had happened. They didn't know if she had, decided to stop, or so they went over they kind of figured out who was her relative, and they asked what had happened to the girl. And the grandparent was really frightened because they had looked away for a couple minutes, and they weren't sure. They thought maybe she went up to the concession stand to go to the bathroom, get ice cream, something like that. So we started digging because we really weren't sure. And she could have been anywhere in a fairly large radius because,
right.
They weren't sure exactly where the hole was. So we started digging, and what was amazing was that all the lifeguards came to dig, and bystanders came to dig, and the volleyball players. So we had such a team effort, and it went on for many minutes, and I thought, my goodness, if she's under the sand, she could have brain damage. She's not getting any oxygen.
Right.
And eventually, all of a sudden, someone said, I think I see her. I think I see hair. And sure enough, we kept digging and unburied her head. She was literally buried alive, standing upright in the sand. The hole had caved in on her.
Oh, my.
And she was perfectly blue, and we got the sand out of her mouth, and and she started gasping, and she was alive. And it was just such an incredible miracle, a miracle that they noticed, a miracle that we found her, and we took her to the hospital, and she made a full recovery.
Wow.
So I think, that story could have gone so differently.
Of course.
Sometimes I thought, she could have been written off as like a missing child. They could have thought she'd gotten kidnapped. So that was the one that stands out in my mind.
That is bizarre, but praise the Lord you found the little girl, and she's fine.
Right. Truly a miracle.
Okay, well, the new book we're talking about today is the follow-up on Heaven's Doorstep, and you, after 7,000 plus responses that you have done as an EMT, you've got a lot of stories to tell, and
yes.
You like to journal, so that turned out to be a good thing, didn't it, that you had kept journals all these years?
It did. It was at my mother's advice back when I was in high school. She said, you should write down the stories that are special to you. And I took her advice. And then all those years later, when I decided that I was going to write a book, I went up into my attic and I dug out the journals, and it was as if the people and the places sprang back to life again. Without the journal, I couldn't have written the book to such detail.
And all of these stories are true, and they're written in the style of like a Chicken Soup for the Soul.
Yes.
Book that series has done. Like 2, 3, 4, 5 pages max of a true story of something that's heartwarming or funny or something that will definitely warm the heart or interest the reader. And so as we open the book on Heaven's Doorstep, let's give a little sample. We're going to read a chapter. You and I will tag team this. And remember, people, this is a true story coming straight out of On Heaven's Doorstep. Take it away, Andrea.
All right. This chapter is called Impressing Your Date. And I start each of the chapters with a verse from the Bible that says, "My shield is God Most High, who saves the upright in heart." That's Psalm 7:10. Chip Hughes sped along Jefferson Avenue on his new mountain bike, deep in thought. The fragrant smell of freshly cut grass, the vibrant burst of color from tulips and cherry blossom trees, and the cacophony of sounds from hungry seagulls were all lost on him. All Chip could think about was that he was going on a first date tonight with the girl of his dreams, Melanie. After months of trying to muster the courage, he had finally called Melanie a few days ago. To his surprise, the conversation went great, and the next thing he knew, he had a dinner date set up. What should I wear? Jeans or khakis? Where should I take her? Casual or someplace more fancy? What if I run out of things to talk about? If dinner goes well, what should we do afterward? Ice cream and a walk on the boardwalk? Chip had recently turned 19, and he didn't have much experience dating. Chip didn't see the car until it was too late. He was thrust violently out of his pleasant reverie when the front tires of his bike struck hard against the rear fender of a green sedan, which was parallel parked close to the curb. His bike stopped abruptly, but he felt his body become airborne as he sailed over the handlebars. The flying sensation didn't last long, however. His body exploded in pain as he burst headfirst through the car's rear window.
"Heel, Mittens, heel," Jenny Jacobson instructed her golden retriever puppy as she approached her car. The pair had just enjoyed a pleasant walk around Weeping Willow Lake. Training Mittens was turning out to be more work than Jenny expected, but she was enjoying it. Jenny paused, puzzled at first, and then exasperated said, "Honestly, Mittens, I don't understand people today. Who would just abandon their bike in the road like that? For goodness sake, if I had approached my car from the other direction, I wouldn't have even seen it. I would have backed up and run right over it. It would have wrecked the bike and probably would have messed up my car too." Mittens cocked his little head and barked once as if in agreement. "Oh my goodness, I don't believe it. Somebody broke my window. I was so focused on the bike, I didn't even notice at first." Tugging on Mittens' leash, she pulled him closer to the car to get a better view. "Hard to see much with these tinted windows," she muttered. At that precise moment, the hair on the back of Jenny's neck stood up. "What in the world is that noise? That creepy, horrible noise? It sounds like the way people breathe in those horror movies." Reaching into her pocket, she grabbed her remote to unlock the car, and taking a deep breath, she wrenched the back door open. A cool, bloody hand flopped out the door and brushed against Jenny's calf. Almost before she realized what she was staring at, a blood-curdling scream burst forth from her lips. A young man was sprawled out across her rear seat, blood dripping from his hands and face. Is he alive? Dear Lord, please tell me this person is alive.
And the dispatcher said on our first aid pagers, request for first aid on the 300 block of Jefferson Avenue for a cyclist versus a car. The patient is currently unconscious and unresponsive. He's out cold, Colleen said, taking hold of Chip's head to stabilize it in case he had a neck injury. Chip, open your eyes for me, she commanded. Chip kept his eyes closed, though he began to make groaning noises. Alec opened the rear door on the other side and squeezed himself in along the floorboard. Wake up, he said, gently rubbing on Chip's breastbone. At the time, it was common to use a technique called a sternal rub to help determine a patient's level of consciousness. If a person reacts to the chest rub, he is responsive to painful stimuli. Chip groaned louder in response to the rub, indicating he could feel pain. That's a good sign. It's certainly better than having no response at all. Alec did a head-to-toe assessment and checked Chip's blood pressure and pulse. Just as he was finishing, Chip's eyes snapped open. For a few seconds, he was silent, his mind trying to figure out exactly where he was and why we were staring at him. Where am I? He asked. You seem to have had an accident with your bike, Colleen said. We're going to take you to the hospital to get checked out, she said reassuringly. Chip nodded his head, answered some questions for Colleen, and then lapsed into silence. I slid a cervical collar around his neck, and then we maneuvered him onto a backboard. As we were sliding him out of the car onto a stretcher, Chip asked, What day is it? Saturday, Alec replied, a little after 2 o'clock. That's what I was afraid you were going to say. Do you think they're going to admit me? I have my first date with someone tonight. I truly wasn't sure if Chip would get admitted or not. It was certainly a possibility, given his mechanism of injury and the fact that he was unconscious for a few minutes. At a minimum, he would be diagnosed with a concussion. He'd need further tests to see if anything else was wrong. As I gazed at his torn lip and the lacerations on his forehead and chin, I figured that he would probably be getting a bunch of stitches. Well, if Chip manages somehow to go on his date tonight, he sure is going to have lots of interesting talking points regarding why his face looks the way it does. Of course, abrasions and lacerations heal. Chip was truly blessed that he was wearing a bicycle helmet, or the outcome of his accident could have been much worse.
That's a great story. So, do you ever run into Chips later in life? You've been doing this for 30 years as an EMT.
I do, and sometimes I recognize them and remember, and other times, because I've been on so many first aid calls, I'm always amazed that people recognize me. Like, I might not remember them right away, but I think in that moment of crisis, I can't believe they can actually remember what we look like.
I think our brains take a picture of moments, these key moments in our lives. What do you think?
I think you must be right, because it is impressive the way people remember.
Well, where can people get your book, On Heaven's Doorstep?
It is available online at Christian retailers, at Amazon and Barnes & Noble. It's also in choice books racks, the inspirational book rack vendors throughout the country in different places, but I'm never exactly sure which racks are carrying it.
Okay. The name of the book again, On Heaven's Doorstep. And we're going to take a break and be back with more from author Andrea Jo Rodgers, telling true stories of God's help in times of crisis. We'll both be back after this.
The Road Show is a listener favorite, which airs each weekday here on the Oasis Radio Network, starting at 1 p.m. Eastern, 12 noon Central. The Road Show also has a great section on our website, oasisnetwork.org. There you'll find audio archives of select past interviews, plus guest lineup, and contact information and links to our Roadshow sponsors and its hosts. So join us for the Roadshow, whether on your radio or on your computer at oasisnetwork.org.
Here's a little bit about today's guest, Andrea Jo Rodgers, from the back of her new book out on Harvest House Publishers, entitled On Heaven's Doorstep. Andrea has been a volunteer EMT for 30 years and has responded to more than 7,000 first aid and fire calls. She holds a clinical doctorate in physical therapy and has worked as a physical therapist in a trauma center for 20 years. Andrea, do you work in teams? Like, do you have a partner when you're dispatched?
On Thursday nights, I do. We have the Thursday night crew. So those are my team members that always come out on that night. But other than that, it's really whoever's available comes.
So how do you assign who's going to do what in the moment?
We have line officers. So we have a captain, lieutenant, first sergeant, and second sergeant. So if the captain is there, they're in charge. If not, I'm the lieutenant that would help to direct people and so on. And after that, it would go based on seniority of how long you've been an EMT.
Well, I'm going to ask you to read another story from On Heaven's Doorstep, and this is a story that includes your co-first responder named Gary. And so you all, this is a true story, listeners.
Yep.
Andrea and Gary were traveling around, I'm assuming in the ambulance, and then you guys actually witnessed an accident. You weren't
We were actually in his car.
Okay, you were in the car,
Yep.
but you all must be paying attention to what's going on when it comes to times of crisis.
Oh, yes.
So you all witnessed an accident.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us the story.
All right. So this chapter is called You Scream, I Scream. The Bible verse, He will yet fill your mouth with laughter and your lips with shouts of joy. That's Job chapter 8, verse 21. Frozen yogurt, Gary said, briefly taking off his baseball cap and running his fingers through his hair. I'm so hot. We need frozen yogurt. I'm in, I said without hesitation. I'm starving. It had been a busy afternoon. A little after lunch, our squad transported a middle-aged woman with a history of asthma who was complaining of difficulty breathing to the emergency room. Her shortness of breath had been gradually increasing over several days, and the oppressive July air wasn't helping. As soon as we had returned to our first aid building, we had received another call to the other side of town for an elderly man with chest pain and shortness of breath. He surmised that he had overdone it by pulling weeds from his front garden bed in the hot summer sun. Now we found ourselves once more at our first aid building. This time, Gary and I were both in the mood for an ice-cold treat. We decided to order the frozen yogurt to go and eat it back at the squad building. A mere 15 minutes later, we were back on the road heading east to headquarters with 2 large cups of vanilla chocolate swirl. I had mini chocolate chips on mine, and Gary chose crushed peanut butter cups as his topping. Gary was driving, so I peeled up the plastic cover on my yogurt and took a few test bites. I glanced up from my frozen yogurt bliss when Gary exclaimed, "Look at that car! It stopped at the intersection, but now it's starting to go." I watched with dismay as an older model brown sedan slowly rolled past a stop sign and headed directly into the middle of the intersection. We both watched in mesmerized horror as the sedan continued its slow-motion journey. A teal-green minivan was heading west toward the intersection, and it was too close to stop in time. The minivan smashed into the sedan, lost control, and began careening wildly down the road, directly toward us. I heard the sound of squealing tires coupled with a muffled scream. I braced myself. "Hang on," Gary yelled, tightening his grip on the steering wheel while pushing down hard on the brakes. I closed my eyes and waited for the inevitable crash. By the grace of God, it didn't happen. Instead, the minivan swerved away from us at the last possible second and went up an embankment, finally coming to rest against a birch tree. Gary grabbed his portable officer's radio and spoke directly to police headquarters. "We need the police and first aid for a 2-car motor vehicle accident," he said, adding our location. We jumped out of Gary's car and rushed to the minivan. A middle-aged woman and a girl who looked to be her teenage daughter sat in the front seats, a look of shock on their faces. The first thing I noticed was the copious amount of blood. It was on the steering wheel, splashed onto the front windshield, and virtually covering the 2 women. It stood in sharp contrast to their pastel-colored T-shirts, oozing downward in ominous dark streaks. "Hi, I'm Gary, and this is Andrea. We're with the Pine Cove First Aid Squad. How are you doing? The police and an ambulance are on the way." He eased open the driver's side door so we could better access the patients. "We're shaken up, but I think we're basically okay," the woman replied, glancing over at her daughter and patting her forearm. I just couldn't believe the way that car came out in front of us like that. There was no way to stop in time or swerve around it. You've lost a lot of blood, I said, peering into the car while slipping on a pair of gloves I happened to have in my pocket. With that amount of blood, I figure they must have some serious lacerations. What blood? The woman asked, perplexed, glancing around. Am I bleeding? She turned to her daughter. Margot, are you sure you're okay? Did you get hurt? Are you bleeding? Margot let out a giggle. Mom, I think that's our ice cream. She ran her finger across the glove compartment and placed her fingertip in her mouth. Yep, it's our chocolate ice cream, all right. I had been so sure that it was blood that it took a second for my brain to register that it was truly just a sweet, icy cold treat. Apparently, the pair had also found a grab-and-go mid-afternoon snack. Within a few short minutes, the police and our first aid squad arrived. Fortunately, the person driving the sedan was also uninjured. Gary and I returned to his car and hurried to gobble down what was left of our melting frozen yogurt treats.
Now that's a happy ending. It's not always happy, but this is a happy ending in this case. That's wonderful. From your book on Heaven's Doorstep.
So I try to intersperse some happy ones with more intense ones.
Thank you. I have called you a first responder throughout today's Roadshow program, Andrea, and you work in a team of first responders, and that would be other EMTs, also paramedics.
Also the police department. So our police arrive first, and they are fantastic. So they're the ones who really initiate care in our town.
And I take it with the fire department as well.
The fire department comes for motor vehicle accidents, of course, fires, and then things that might be unusual, for example, beach calls if we need lighting. And our fire department also started a water rescue team.
Well, you're going to now play the role of your mentor from many years ago, 30 years ago, and you're going to encourage us, if any of us listening today, if our interest is piqued in thinking about, well, maybe I could be an emergency medical technician.
Well, we have people from all ages, from high school through well into their 80s, and a lot of the people who join our squad after they retire, they do not come from medical backgrounds. They come from, engineering, accounting, banking, finance, government, anything you can think of, and they just decide they'd like to help people. And we do the training, so if you have the interest, New Jersey has a fund so that it pays for you to become an EMT as long as you're on a first aid squad.
So what is the standard now in America? You mentioned that it's turning into more of a paid position, but there are still volunteer positions, I would think, in many states tuned in today.
I think so, yeah, especially in the more rural areas.
Which would make a lot of sense. What training is involved to become an EMT?
Well, for our first aid squad, if you're interested, you can join almost as an observer and just kind of get your feet wet and see, do you like it or not? Mm-hmm. And if you do, then we'll provide you with certification in CPR and basic first aid to kind of give you a little more confidence. And then we have members ride for 6 months to really make sure that they like it, that they're committed, and also gives them experience so that when they take the EMT class, then they can apply that knowledge that they've already learned in the field, so it makes the coursework a little bit easier. And then the course itself, it increased to 200 hours, so it's not a small commitment. It takes it's almost like taking a college course. It's a couple nights a week and a bunch of Saturdays for a semester.
Who is a good candidate for certification? He or she can be about any age, other than a minor, but have you found that certain people make the best volunteers?
No, I think, honestly, in order for us to work cohesively, we really do benefit from all ages because our retired members are wonderful because they're home during the daytime, and they also answer at night, too. They answer all the time. But the working crowd answers more in the evening. School kids answer after school and weekends. So it really, it's great to have variety.
And these people need to be able to cope with stress and trauma, I would imagine.
Right. So sometimes people also say, well, I can't stand the sight of blood. But then I say, well, honestly, most of our calls are not bloody. We do get some, but there's so many different things that can happen to people. Mm-hmm. And if it's a call that you really think is too much for you, then you can always, we tell people to go and we tell them to check the radio. That means to go out to just get away if it's too much for them, and they go outside.
Do you, as the EMT at the scene, are you the person who lifts the patient onto the gurney or stretcher?
So we do that together with the police. Yep.
Okay. All right. So the volunteer needs to be in pretty good physical shape if you're going to perform that function.
You do, but usually there's enough of us. We have some members who really can't lift, so we can work around that.
It sounds like about anybody could do this then, the way you're talking about it.
Yeah, and our stretchers now, we have power stretchers. So once they're on the stretcher, you don't have to lift the stretcher into the ambulance. It's in our town, it's hydraulic.
Really?
So
I never knew that.
Yeah. So it's great. That's just within the last 5 years or so. When I first joined the squad, it was some pretty heavy lifting.
You're back.
Now you can literally have one person puts the person into the ambulance.
Really? I bet your back appreciates that at this point.
It sure does.
Okay.
And I like being a physical therapist, so I want to stay in my profession a long
Amen.
time.
Amen. So you touched on this earlier, but people interested in becoming an emergency medical technician as a volunteer or making it a paid career, you can do what's called a ride-along, where you ride, I guess, in the ambulance and just silently witness what's going on and determine if this is something for you or not.
Yep, and even we put people to work pretty quickly. If they seem like they're interested, then we'll teach them where everything is, and at least almost to function like a gopher. Can you get this? Can you get that? And then as their confidence level increases, we'll let them do what they feel comfortable doing.
Okay, so for people listening across the country today, where do you call to sign up for a ride-along?
So probably the easiest way would be to go to your town's website, and usually they'll have a page for the first aid squad or the rescue squad or EMS, and to try to contact them that way. Some towns, like our squad, has its own website even. We have nowadays everyone's so wired in. We have a Facebook page and things like that. That's
great. Well, the book we're talking about today is On Heaven's Doorstep by our special guest, Andrea Jo Rodgers. And tell us again how people can get the book, Andrea.
You can get it on with Christian online retailers, Christian bookstores, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and it's where choice books are sold, the inspirational book vendors throughout the country, but I'm never quite sure. I know it's out there, but I'm never quite sure which vendors have it at what time.
Well, I am David Warren, your host on today's program, enjoying my time with Andrea Jo Rodgers. When we come back after this final break, Andrea will tell us about receiving the following page from a 911 dispatcher. Request for first aid at 524 Shady Grove Lane for an unresponsive person. She'll tell you the rest of the story after this.
I'm David Warren, Program Director at Oasis Radio Network and one of the hosts of this podcast. All of our hosts enjoy hearing from you, our listening family, so drop us a note. Our email address is roadshow@oasisnetwork.org. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast and you'll receive new episodes on your mobile devices. And now, back to the show.
Thanks for joining us today. I'm David Warren, talking with Andrea Jo Rodgers about her new book, On Heaven's Doorstep. This book is available wherever books are sold. Andrea has mentioned many outlets, but it's pretty easy to find. Just you can Google it. And again, the title is On Heaven's Doorstep by Andrea Jo Rodgers. Well, before we go, I want you to tell us the true story from the last chapter of the book, and that chapter is entitled The Miracle of Bethany Walker. Tell us about your interaction with this special lady.
Okay. Well, one night, a bunch of us were on a first aid call for a woman with a shoulder injury. And as we were loading her into the ambulance, we were dispatched for a second call for an unresponsive person. So Jesse, Jose, and I left the first call to go to the second one. And like I said, we're blessed to live in a small town, so we recognized the address, and we all knew it was the Walker family. In fact, we'd been on there for a call in the past for the grandfather. And so on our way there, the dispatcher updated us. They said CPR is in progress. So when we arrived, the younger Mr. Walker was standing outside, and he called each of us by name, and I'll never forget. He spoke with such urgency and desperation, and he said, "Andrea, Jesse, quick, do something." So when we got inside, we made a horrible discovery. The patient wasn't the elderly Mr. Walker. It was actually the young Mr. Walker's wife, Bethany. And the police officers were already working on her. They had tried to defibrillate her, but they said that there was no shock advised. So we jumped in, and Jesse took over the defibrillator. And I remember when he pressed the analyze button, I prayed really, one of those quick silent prayers, like, God, we help you right now. We need your help now. Please let the shock work. And the pressure was on. The stakes were high. Her life hung in the balance, and we wanted to help them so badly. So Jesse pressed the shock button, and he told me to check for a pulse. I put my fingers on her carotid artery on her neck, and there was no pulse. So we continued CPR. And this went on for a time. And then after the third shock, I finally felt a faint pulse. So just then, the paramedics arrived, and they noted that Bethany's pupils were very large. They were fixed and dilated, which can mean that the person could possibly have a poor prognosis. They intubated her. They put, to control her airway, and then we put her in the ambulance. And as we took her to the hospital, she was still unconscious and completely unresponsive. She wasn't breathing on her own. So when we dropped her off, we had heavy hearts, but we had hope. And 5 long days passed, and then Jesse said he had spoken to Mr. Walker and that she was still completely unresponsive. And he said the doctors told him there was very little hope for recovery, and he should start thinking about taking her off life support. So I just remember my heart plummeted because I was so praying that she was going to make it. And her husband said he couldn't even think about taking her off life support yet, that he needed more time. So we kept praying for a miracle, and it happened exactly 3 days later. He was sitting with her in the ICU, and she woke up and she said, "What just happened to me?" So over the next 15 years, I ran into her in various places, shopping, at the supermarket, in town, biking around, and it was just, I felt like it was such a blessing.
Well, you wrote a follow-up in this book about her, so if you would, read page 217.
Okay. Over the next couple of years, I ran into Mrs. Walker in various places, biking around Pine Cove, shopping at the supermarket, and strolling on the boardwalk. I learned that she retired from her job and started her own catering business. Just the sight of her filled me with joy. Thank you, Lord, for letting me bear witness to such a special miracle of life. About 15 years had passed from the day our rescue squad responded to help Bethany. It was a beautiful October day, and my family and I were taking a walk on the boardwalk. "Andrea, is that you?" a somewhat familiar voice asked. I glanced up and saw a handsome middle-aged gentleman with a bright smile. It was Alan Walker. "It's so wonderful to see you," I exclaimed. "Did you see Bethany?" he asked, pulling his baseball cap more firmly onto his head so it didn't inadvertently blow away with the wind. "No, is she here with you?" I asked, my heart lifting with happiness. Mr. Walker smiled and pointed toward the picnic tables at the pavilion about 25 feet away. "Come on over and say hello. It's been so long and should love to see you," he said. "I'd love to," I replied. Memories of that night came rushing back, the horror, the disappointment, and ultimately the hope. "Bethany, do you remember who this is?" Alan asked, coming up behind his wife and tapping her on the shoulder. "Of course," she replied, a smile lighting up her face as we hugged. "Bethany had a long, difficult recovery, but she's doing incredibly well now," Alan said, his eyes shining with pride. "We're here watching my grandson play," Bethany said, pointing to a young boy who was frolicking on the beach. "That's Cole's son." And that's when it hit me. I reflected on that night 15 years before when I had sent an urgent prayer for help up to heaven. Here we were, so many years later, and the answer to my prayer stood before me. She's watching her young grandson play on the beach, a grandson that, if things had turned out differently that night, Bethany would have never met. In that moment, I knew that a living miracle stood before me, the miracle of Bethany Walker.
a true story that you were a part of, a miracle that you were a part of.
Yep.
Is that what keeps you doing this for 30 plus years, helping people as an EMT?
I think it does. I think there's certain events like that just, I think, wow, it's all worth it, getting up in the middle of the night. And sometimes I have to, tell my family I got to go, and sometimes it's not the best timing, but they're very understanding.
I bet they are. And I know that they enjoy the stories when you come back and tell them.
Right.
And you're probably working on book 3 with the stories that you're collecting.
Yep, so hopefully if book 2 does well, then there'll be a book 3.
Well, that's why you're on the program today, so we can tell people about you, Andrea Jo Rodgers, and the book On Heaven's Doorstep, God's Help in Times of Crisis, True Stories from a First Responder. Again, thank you for helping the people of New Jersey and ultimately our country and all that you do as a volunteer. And we gave some information earlier, but tell us again how people, if they feel a tug on their heart to look into becoming an emergency medical technician as a volunteer, where can they start to do like a ride-along or get more information?
The first place to start would be to call their town and ask about their emergency medical services, and oftentimes your town's website will have information that'll link you to like a squad's web page, or at least give you information about how to contact them.
And Andrea, I want to encourage our listeners of the Oasis Radio Network. Of course, we always want to respect the ambulance as you hear that siren going and it's time to pull off to the right side of the road and make way. But don't forget to pray for what's taking place.
Say a prayer for them.
Yeah,
exactly.
Say a prayer for the patients on that ambulance and also for the EMTs and the paramedics getting that person safely to the hospital. Andrea, this has been great.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Congratulations on your 2 books and your upcoming 3rd.
Thank you so much.
All right. Well, Andrea Jo Rodgers has been my special guest. We've been talking about her book, On Heaven's Doorstep. Well, for Andrea, I'm David Warren, and it's been another great Roadshow.
You've been listening to The Roadshow. If you'd like to write to us, here's our address. The Roadshow, P.O. Box 1924, Tulsa, Oklahoma, 74101. Our email address is roadshow@oasisnetwork.org. The views of today's guest aren't necessarily those of this station, but we do appreciate and thank our guest for spending this time with us. The Roadshow, an Oasis Network presentation.